now let's turn over to Katharine Stevens from the American Enterprise Institute, who is going to expand beyond just what's been going on these last 9 months into what's been going on the last 5 decades. So Katharine, I will turn it over to you.
So Julia and Bryan have been describing what is really a truly devastating impact of COVID on America's most vulnerable kids. What I'm going to be explaining is, however bad the situation seems, I think it's actually worse. So disaster on top of a disaster, you might even say catastrophe on top of a catastrophe. The operative issue is, as Bryan was explaining, the data showing where kids are compared to where they would have been, which is what I'm going to talk about. Long before COVID, the achievement of disadvantaged kids was much lower, and achievement gaps between higher and lower income kids much bigger than most people realize. For decades, the public schools have failed to educate large proportions of low income kids, and we have no reason to expect they'll do any better after COVID. For much of the 20th century, we've seen school as the pathway to a successful future in America, especially since President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty in 1965. We viewed the public schools as the key to addressing inequality and ensuring opportunity for every child. Over the last half century, we've dedicated a great deal of energy and public resources to making sure the schools work for all kids. But way before COVID, it's been increasingly clear that the public schools are incapable of closing achievement gaps and ensuring equal opportunity for all children. On the 2019 National Assessment of Education Progress exam, almost 4 of 5 lower income kids scored below proficient in reading in grades 4, 8, and 12. 40% of lower income 12th graders scored below NAEP's lowest level of basic in reading. More than half scored below basic in math. A major study out of Harvard and Stanford recently found that achievement gaps between wealthier and poorer children have remained unchanged over the past 50 years. 2017 ACT scores showed huge gaps in college readiness. Just 9% of students in the class of 2017 who came from low-income families, whose parents did not attend college, and who identified as Black, Hispanic, American Indian, Pacific Islander were strongly ready for college. The readiness rate for students with none of those demographic characteristics was 6 times higher. Next slide, please. So I'm going to share some data with you from some of my recent research. In the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be releasing an interactive map on the AEI website, which provides state-level data on the percentage of lower and higher income 8th graders who scored below the lowest level of basic in reading and math on the widely respected National Assessment of Education Progress exam in 2019, along with per student spending for each state, which, as you'll see on the map, varies hugely. So I just want to say a couple of things about these variables. The reason we're focusing on 8th graders is that is the highest grade level that NAEP scores are available, the highest level of grade level, excuse me, that has state by state NAEP scores. So the scores that you're seeing for 8th graders are after 8 or 9 years in school. NAEP, the National Assessment for Education Progress, has, as many of you probably know, 3 levels. Basic is the lowest, proficient, and advanced. So what we looked at is the percentage of kids, 8th graders, who scored below NAEP's lowest level, indicating they lack minimum competence in reading and math achievement. I'm sorry, Tyler, can you just go back, please? Tyler, thanks so much. Just hold it here for 1 minute, thanks. So that's the first thing I wanted to explain. The second thing is, the question that Chris had asked Julia, what does lower income and higher income mean? This is important because the only way at this point we have of looking at income is through the free and reduced price lunch program. So when we say lower income or high poverty schools, that's being assessed by the percentage of kids who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. But there's something really important to know about that, which is that about 16% of 8th graders are in poverty. 46% are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. The reason for that is over the last decade or so, there have been various legislative expansions to the program, meaning a large proportion of the kids who are in that lower income group are actually middle or even higher income. So I just wanted to explain those things. And then the next thing I wanted to call your attention to is a report that I just released that Chris referred to, Still Left Behind, How America's Schools Keep Failing Our Children, in which I describe a half century of failed school reform efforts since President Johnson first emphasized the role of schools in addressing poverty as a cornerstone of his 1965 War on Poverty legislation. I also in that I also described the free and reduced price lunch issue. If people are interested in learning more about that, there's the data and research explaining how the free and reduced price lunch category is currently intersecting with actual income. Next slide, please. So this is data from the MAP. This is the percentage of 8th graders who scored at Proficient or above on the 2019 NAEP Reading Assessment. So you can see almost half of higher income kids, meaning kids who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, scored at Proficient or above. Just 20% of lower income 8th graders scored at Proficient and above. And I also want to again emphasize in that 20%, in that lower income group, which is just a little less than half of all kids, there are kids who probably did much better, and then kids who are really poor. So if we had data on children who are actually poor, those numbers would be looking much worse. Next slide, please. So this slide is the flip. This is the percentage of 8th graders who scored below the lowest level of basic on the 2019 reading assessment. And you'll see, again, 40% of lower income kids fail to demonstrate minimum competence in reading. Next slide, please. These two slides are the same, exactly the same data for math. So there's not going to be any big surprises here. Next slide, please. So almost half of lower income kids scored below the lowest level of basic. If we had data on who was actually in poverty and saw those numbers, I would guess that it would be higher than that. And this was pre-COVID. This was all pre-COVID. I also want to emphasize that these outcomes are not for lack of trying. As you can see in this graph, public spending on the K-12 schools has more than doubled since 1970, from about $5,000 per student in 1970 to more than $12,000 in 2016 in today's dollars. Even as those flat lines you see at the bottom, average NAEP scores of 12th graders, those are national scores for the end product of the K-12 system, have remained entirely flat. Next slide, please. So now what? The question I think we need to be asking is, how can the same schools that failed these children for years before COVID help them catch up after? And I think the answer is that they can't. The only way we can head off an enormous catastrophe is to find a new approach. And I want to underscore one of the approaches that Bryan mentioned, which is rolling out some kind of national tutoring program. I think it's by far our best bet. Bryan, as you know, the research on tutoring is really remarkable. In school, small group, one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three tutoring improves the students' outcomes like nothing I've ever seen. The many higher income parents, as we know, are already using tutoring services. England has just launched last month. England launched a national tutoring program to address exactly the issues we've been talking about. And there are several state models that I think would be very useful in a number of states that have been existing long before COVID, and 2 states that I'm aware of have just launched statewide tutoring programs to address the COVID catastrophe, as we might call it. With that, I will turn the screen back over to Chris. Thanks so much.